后就是那个现在你就可以然后这里刚开的这个啊，是一个音乐。好，像这台电脑，颜色的，就像我们在讲话的那个，那个老师的那个样，上面都有装修，然后如果他收音，比如说现场聊天，那时候还是在看。那他就他的历程，每个看报告会看一下情况，是如果平常不需要，有时候要分析其余的机构还有一个要写，知道我们啊，
跳都会过来，前面约好。他老中午这个是
哦，这个看，比如说他现在，比如说在简介多少介绍，但如果是看看但如果说他是内容啊，可能会打到这个内容，或者说可能就会切到这里面，反正就是主要是这个，然后剩下就是如果需要进口的，电脑打开给他，对，他只是休息而已。
好，好，演讲时间，好，我先做个简短的介绍啊。那江浙已经在这边是谢老师，谢倩玲老师。那么现在在台科大建筑系啊，担任老师。然后呢，但过去蛮多的在实务界的经验啊。也在一个事务所里面啊，也做了蛮多 project。刚请教应该已经有9年的工作经验嘛，很久。那这个那也在过去在新加坡待过啊。那前面往前面推，在英国 AA 读硕士。那再往前面是在香港是香港大学的建筑系的学士哈。
之后也在 Glasgow。
在 Glasgow， 漏掉这一段，那就是很丰富的一个背景。那不管是在学校里面教书的经验，在实务界实作的经验啊，那谢老师也做 research 啊，也投了一些像这个外面的一些竞赛。那今天我们让谢老师来做一些分享啊，所以会可能包含学校里面的教学的经验分享，也会有 在实务领域的一些经验了哈。那就欢迎谢老师。你可能可以补充一点，我刚刚介绍不太完整。
很完整，够很多了。
好了，这个给你。
要用？
不一定要用，如果你觉得声音够大。
你听得到我说什么？
哦，对对，他们会。
所以一定要用。
收音会有streaming 出去。
But I have to apologize. I have to give the lecture in English. That's all right. If you do not understand, then just raise your hand. Simply because my 中文没有我的英文那么好，就是我可以沟通，但是 1 hour is too much. 你不会明白的。So anyway, so nice to meet you. I'm Shirla. Today, I'm gonna give a very brief talk about myself, and also actually it's the philosophy I myself believe in architectural realization, or you can say the architectural design and mapping process, which I call it a practice research hybrid approach. So 中文就是实务研究双轨并行的建筑实践。And I would like to start today by addressing this gap that I think it is very common perception that professional practice, a lot of people, especially registered architect in the world, I would say 90% of us actually think practice is purely commercial or technical. Practice a lot is about how, if you would like to ask a question, while research stays with a very big gap in between that is purely academic or theoretical. Usually research, we say that we usually like to frame research as the why. And as if in many academic circles, research is often framed in the domain of why that is only associated with theory, with discourse, with questions of meaning, intention, and speculation. And at the same time, in professional practice, the how is frequently actually reduced to something only a matter of execution, delivery, or technical resolution. A set of procedures as if it's to realize decisions that have already been made from practice. So this is a very linear process. You do research first, ask all the why, and then once sort of you find the answer, or when your deadline approaches, then you jump to practice. This seems to be a very clear, intuitive division between the two. But I would argue, at least my philosophy from the past 10 to 15 years, since I graduated from 研究所, I would argue that this is actually very deeply limiting. Because this gap that we see on the screen right now, that is being produced by this sort of thinking, where thinking and making are no longer continuous. It's linear, but it is not continuously looping. Instead, they are separated into different institutions, different timelines, and different values. And perhaps more importantly, actually, is that it undermines both sides. It undermines research by confining it only to abstraction. At the same time, it undermines practice by reducing it to only implementation. So I would like to introduce this model to define what I call the hybrid model. This redefinition of not just as a balance between the research and practice. So we usually say a good academic project, especially the studio, when you are being given a design brief, you do maybe it's a 16-week studio, you do maybe 4 weeks of research, and then 12 weeks you execute. I think that is also still quite limiting because this is just sort of a balance. You can balance it to 4, 12, 6, 8, 4. But actually, let us, starting from today, restructure the relationship between the two. I think research not asked only what we are trying to achieve, but also how that ambition, the vision, can be made possible what conditions the parameters shape it, what constraints define it, and what systems allowed it to exist in the real world. In that sense, research is not a phase that comes before design. It should not, nor it is commentary that comes after design to justify your design, to analyze. It should not as well. It is indeed a mode of inquiry embedded, I think, within the design process itself. It is the work of asking, why this program? Why this spatial logic? Why this material? Why this detail? And equally the same, I think research should also carry the how. Not only the practice should carry the how. Equally, research should ask, how should it be constructed? How should it perform? How should it connect? And how should it endure? These are not separate questions. They are actually fundamentally intertwined because every why actually implies a how, and every how also carries a why. And this is why I see research as a form of disciplined inquiry into what I call the middle part that is very important, architectural intelligence. It is not only theoretical reflection, it is also the methodological investigation. So now we establish that research carries both why and how. Then what is practice? When practice is not just the how. I think practice is where this investigation is realized. Practice is not the opposite of research. It is, again, the embodiment of research. So research is embedded in the design process itself, and practice is the embodiment of the research. It is the stage practice where ideas are tested against reality, where drawings meet neighbor, where systems meet material, where design becomes accountable to construction, time, budget, code, and human use. And precisely through this encounter between research and practice, architecture becomes real. And an idea that cannot be built is definitely should not just stay in research. It is actually not fully resolved. Practice is the art of making, but making is never neutral. To make is to design, to refine, to negotiate, to resolve. In that sense, practice is not simply the final step in this linear process. Together, the two phases should form a continuous process. They form a loop. I believe the relationship between research and practice should not be understood as a hierarchy, but as a continuum. So I would like to first start with a statement that I sort of constructed. Research gives architecture its direction, while practice gives architecture its form. And it is precisely in this transition from investigation to realization that the most meaningful architectural intelligence, architectural work actually happens. And perhaps this is where architecture becomes most powerful. Each project becomes a site of investigation, and each realization becomes a form of knowledge. First, I would like to briefly introduce the timeline of my work. Personally, I did not actually start, or I didn't actually plan when I was a student to get so fully or deeply into academia. I actually, once after I graduated, or even before I graduated from master, I was already working as a year out. That's the British system. So I actually spent, as Julian has said, I have spent more than 9 years in practice, actually before I started teaching part-time in academia 6 years ago. So this is a very brief timeline, almost take on 7 years of my life in practice that I work a lot on massive project, spatial field market in London, skyscraper in Indonesia, mixed use retail mall in China, and I will focus more on talking about airports that actually makes at least then half of my practice life, and how it also then evolved into my hybrid approach between practice and research. But let me first start into a smaller scale that my own practice and lab has done. As a concrete example, which is the Fokker Japanese omakase restaurant in Beijing. This is actually, I will talk about it because I think it very clearly defined my methodology in practice, while after I got out of the big corporate, that incorporates very much about the why as a reason, the how as part of the reason as well, and the making as in practice. The why of this project was an inquiry into fiber space. Why should a dining experience in a bustling city in Beijing feel very heavy? Why can't we evoke the translucency of traditional Japanese paper in a modern fire-rated commercial interior? So I would call this why, as in the materiality, in actually as a research process when we are building this project. To evoke the organic tactile nature of such traditional Japanese omakase in a modern building. This project, fortunately enough, we actually won 2 awards 2 years ago because it was completed in 2023. It got the award in Dancing and also IIDA Asia Pacific. The how during this design process was actually where I think the most interesting research came from. When we have the why that we chose the material of using fiber space, the major question came into when it is in an office tower. This restaurant, by using paper as fiber, how does that being passed of the fire code and also can be built? We actually eventually studied for months of how to create a different texture of the paper pulp. We tested different light diffusion, tactile response, and structural substance. Eventually, we used, although you can see cardboard here in our testing, but eventually we were using actually aluminum panel for the paper to actually grow to become the feature wall of the restaurants. The actual realization also of the floating box, which, because as you can see from the plan, there is a sushi place around here and a major grilling place to form a holistic Japanese dining experience. This floating block and the gold cracks that were on the wall is where I think the practice actually makes the craftsmanship and the physical manifestation of such research methodologies and research of materials being realized. And another project that my firm practice and also joining with my current university, National Taiwan University of Science and Technology, we actually pitched in the Venice Biennale for last year. And I think this micro scale of a pavilion representing Taiwan, we call it Revisiting Taiwan Tin House Culture, is another very interesting demonstration instead of material research, but culture research in terms of realization of practice. The why of the project actually was an inquiry into cultural identity and marginalized architecture in Taiwan. I'm sure all of you know, in both the academic and professional discourse of Taiwan, tin houses, 贴皮屋, are actually often dismissed as ugliness in the city. They are urban scars. But perhaps because I'm actually originally from Hong Kong, as a foreigner, I actually see this as a very interesting beauty in the city of Taiwan, although they are mostly illegal, temporary, or unsightly. I actually, me and my team actually asked intellectually why to challenge this perspective from local Taiwanese. We asked, why can't we see this structure as part of the Taiwanese identity, the hyper-local vernacular? Why can't we validate this design? You do not actually need a lot of architects to have this tepi built on the rooftops or at the side of the street. How can we validate this to actually define our city? And the how of such research was where the research gained its teeth. We didn't actually just want to take photos and put them on the wall. The methodology of realizing it, to put it into practice, we actually embarked on a methodological investigation into digital mediation. So apart from bringing the tin houses as a pavilion of Taiwan in the Venice Biennale, of course, we collaborated with 建筑师 like Wang Jie, 建筑师 that was one of our guest critics today. Since he is so famous of designing residential houses, apart from him, we collaborated with 20 other, we call 中sinh代, newer generation of local Taiwanese architects who have won all the residential awards in Taiwan. So the showcase, the exhibition actually became a question of feasibility. We built the tin houses, which are the normal residences, habitation of space. But that is also the exhibition stands that actually we were showcasing the award-winning residences by local Taiwanese architects. And also at a very major room, we also used digital to revisit the Taiwan tin house culture. So we investigated into an AR app that once visitors could point to maybe a wall, then you will see some of the residents in the tepi wall would be talking to you, like as if this is an interview. So this is a how that we are trying to make what Taiwan has always tried to hidden to become invisible, we make it visible to the global stage. How do we review the invisible layers of life in this country and this invisible so-called ugly social structure hidden within a corrugated metal sheet? We researched and developed this augmented reality framework. And this wasn't just about making a cool app. It was a rigorous study of how digital overlays can act as a bridge between the physical hardware, the practice, we call it, of the tin house, and the social software of the people that are living in there. We investigated how to synchronize space tracking with cultural narratives, ensuring that the technology served the inquiry rather than overshadowing it. So this project I showed you, I don't think it is just an exhibition design like what normal pavilions of different nations in Venice Biennale is. It was indeed a computational and cultural research. The development of the AR interface of the how, and more importantly, the mapping of the vernacular data in Taiwan. And the pavilion itself became the practice, the realization and making of this dual-layered research. It was the moment where the why, the cultural validation, and the how, the build-up and the AR methodology become a tangible lived space for the global audience in Venice. So scaling, so much about my own practice. Scaling from the micro scale of materiality and cultural research, this takes half of my practice life, that is territory, infrastructure. The philosophy I'm proposing, constructing a practice research hybrid architectural philosophy, I don't think is limited by scale. It is a methodology that is just as operative when we move from a single room to a pavilion to a regional territory of airports. In traditional practice, an airport is often seen as a purely technical problem, a machine mostly for processing passengers. But if we apply this hybrid model that I just proposed, we begin to ask deeper research questions. The why. Like, why do these massive infrastructural anchors restructure metropolitan accessibility? Why do they generate new urban modes in one city but remain isolated from each other? The how, also as part of the research, How can we engage with aviation infrastructure, not just as engineer? Airports are mostly an engineering project, but as architects, or even more as generative designers, how do we use computable topological structure to actually ensure that that airport is not just a non-place, a homogeneous system, but as a vital origin of the city? So I have done 4 airports in the world. 2 major ones are in India, one in Delhi, which is the Indira Gandhi International Airport, IGIA. The how was actually a disciplined inquiry into flow logic. For the airport, mostly the first priority to design is to solve out the logistics. But instead, we were not drawing plans. We were researching the how of a logical system. We tested the logical system of different geometry, which is relating directly to the different circulation, whether it should be an I concourse, a wedge concourse, or eventually what we decided is what we call the Y concourse. Why did we decide the Y concourse? It is a major reconstruction that we actually demolish this part of the existing airport and rebuilding another terminal. And it has already finished. Sorry. So what we are interested the most is the concourse planning, especially this Y option that we have studied other airport configurations. The Y is not just a shape. It's not just like another shape, like a circle or a square. It is a way of thinking about circulation as architecture. In the design, the departure flow is organized so that passenger moves from the check-in hall through the central retail zone, then into the F&B here, food and beverage. And finally, towards the bus gate on the ground, apron plan, or to the remote gate, to the contact gates at the departure hall. It's the same for the arrival level, that from the contact gate, the passenger would have to pass through the F&B towards the shopping and then going to the arrival hall. This whole system, where I think this is where the project becomes important to my larger argument about the hybrid model. The how is not the end of the design process. It's not that once we have drawn the Y option, finished the circulation, then this design has finished. It is actually where the site of design intelligence is tested. The Y concourse forced a series of questions. How do we actually distribute passengers without confusion? How do we keep circulation efficient when still giving retail and food areas maximum exposure? How do we allow an airport to grow without breaking its internal logic? These are all sort of research questions, while at the same time, these are also practice questions because they must be resolved in the real planning to be executed in the drawings, in the sections, and also in real operational terms. So this airport does not begin with a formal idea and then seek technical confirmation later. It actually began with a rigorous investigation of movement, capacity, sequence, and also phasing in the future. And the Y option become the visible outcome of this investigation. Another example is following IGIA, my role as a senior architectural designer for the Hyderabad Airport expansion also shifted the research focus, but from plan to the tectonics. If the IGIA in Delhi I was just talking about is mostly about flow logic in plan, that is our research question, this airport in Hyderabad, our GIA, is about how an airport can be given identity through the section, roof, and spatial atmosphere. And I'm going to show you why. This T-shaped airport was existing with just the middle. And our scope was to design the expansion with the green and the red on the two sides, like the wings. Again, like the flow logic, we have to ask this question of how to resolve the passengers first within an infinite and very fluid transition from the terminal to the pier. But more importantly, the why actually was an inquiry growing into growth and resilience. The how became the problem to solve of structural continuity. How do we actually stitch a massive new expansion of the two wings into an operating terminal without stopping any of the operation of the existing airport? So as you know, airport is a very large infrastructural project in itself. This airport on its own right already composed of 8 floors and 5,500 acres. The expansion design proposal, the roof was not just being treated as a simple cover. We investigated as a research of how two approaches can actually represent the identity of Hyderabad. Approach one, using the national birds, the wings, so to create this fluidity of the roof. And secondly, we used the diamond, which was actually a historical and traditional industry for the economy of Hyderabad itself. And we studied this tessellation and proposed. We studied the light, how light's coming through, and also to reserve the very complex geometry into practice with the realization of that. Of course, we studied sunlight, and eventually the wings actually was chosen as a threshold element that helps define the identity of this city, forming a very efficient sequence of the space underneath it. And the roof not become just a technical object, it is then a spatial instrument of how the process and circulation actually operate underneath it. This is some of the details in practice, also part of the how methodology that we attach. We call it the edge condition of the new roofs into the existing terminals, and how the circulation can actually provide a very smooth transition into all the additional gates of the new airport. Apart from the circulation and the tectonic, to define this realization project, we also designed all the small furnitures, the counters, the sittings, even the signage to give the city identity, because I don't know if you have thought about it, airport is actually the first thing ever a traveler or a foreigner encounters with the city. It is also the first thing ever a citizen, when they returns home, to come back to. Although airport does not by itself has its own program per se, it is mostly just for transit and circulation, and with lots of retail stores. It is actually a very dominant building typology. And it is precisely through this professional immersion of actually executing and designing the international airport that I began to identify this profound gap that I have first addressed in the seminar. Our research problem, I think, being very hidden in plain sight. Working across continents, I began to question the very globally homogeneous, overly proportioned, retail-driven spaces that airport has actually created. If you ask all the airports in the world, they basically have the same function, retail shops. It's only whether the retail shops are luxury Chanel or Louis Vuitton, or cheap vernacular local shops that are selling maybe Vietnamese noodles. They are all retail, very commercial. The how of technical execution was often being used to serve a why, and that why was purely commercial, often at the expense of social, culture, and civic experience. After working for airports for 5 years, I recognized a critical need for a new kind of research. That's how I actually started turning into academia. This research that evaluates the actual civic value of this major infrastructure. This major infrastructure are actually heavily paid and funded by taxpayers, by your money. But do they actually serve you? Do they actually serve the city, or they only serve the consumers? So this realization drove my shift towards what I called aviation urbanism. I moved from simply asking how to build a terminal very efficiently, like I did in 2 Indian airports. How do I build the roof without rain flowing into the interior or the detail to connect to the existing roof? I actually asked, how can we transform this massive infrastructure into more human-centric urban spaces? In my hybrid model, my professional experiences in the 2 Indian airports as a practice, the baseline of realization now fuels my research, my current research and my common research framework into the symbiosis between the airport and the city. This is where my first option studio, Redefining Airports, has begun in Singapore in 2019. So when I was teaching at Singapore University of Technology and Design, the studio starts from a fundamental challenge to the airport typology itself. As a very dominant infrastructure, the question asks whether an airport can be an urban incubator, an urban hub, whether it can actually catalyze urban social transformation, and whether it should stimulate peripheral expansion or help revitalize an existing city. This is a very direct extension of the questions that I have encountered or have asked myself in the practice. The design studio is not separate from the airport projects. I started to form this academic space where these questions are tested openly by 12 of my students to demonstrate how airports can be understood not only as logistical machine, not only as flow of circulation, but as also spatial, civic, and architectural systems with real urban consequences. The studio frames the airport through the relationship between the city, whether it is a city airport like most of the old airports, like Songshan Airport in Taipei, or a city airport, which is at the peripheral of a city, or even it forms a sort of new city like Taoyuan and the aerotropolis. I was speculating with the student, in the future, if the aerotropolis can be actually a mix of both, or actually a third generation that, especially with drones and all the flying taxis, etc., could airports actually be separated or inserted in different parts of the city and gives a completely new relationship with the city itself. As you know, I'm from Hong Kong. That's why I look at Hong Kong as the very sharp measurement for such relationship. First, because we have the historical memory of the old Kai Tak airport, which, as you see, the plane basically just flies 10 meters above the roof. And we also have the new airport, which is completely new as a complete reclaimed island here. The new airport actually indicate a very interesting, I think, phenomenal urban relationships that most cities also encounter. Once the airport was there with its infrastructure, a lot of new town, airport city actually grew, not from nowhere, but because as the airport, as the node, and as the hub, it generated a lot of urban nodes and urban neighborhoods. The airport is no longer only a threshold for departure or arrival. It becomes a generator of a major urban structure. So we asked in the studio whether we can find a middle ground model where the infrastructure provides both the efficiency within the old city, but also the civic integration, unlike the peripheral city at the island. with the of course, we know since we are in Asia, Asia is the epicenter of aviation growth globally. With the epic growth in Asia, and now because of the Iran war, possibly you must have seen the news that for one day, there was no flight along any Middle East air. I actually proposed 3 sites for the students in this studio, all 3 capital or old capital cities in Southeast Asia: Yan'an in Myanmar, Hanoi in Vietnam, and Phnom Penh in Cambodia. All my students chose one of the sites and then redesigned the airport by itself. The studio was grounded in the theoretical methodology, like I say, with research on typology by Rabi and Monio. The key idea is that the architect works freely with types because there are 2 distinct moments. One, the moment of the typology, and the moment of formal definition. So in the studio, typology was not treated as a very static category, but are defined as transformation. What does it mean? The airports became a type that can absorb other programs, other civic possibilities, and other social structures. Like this, the diagram then has become, if it is a city airport, on top of just airport, we are starting to absorb, maybe we can ask whether the airport can also be an art village, apart from just retail. Can there be a school right next to the airport? Or even as an airport city, whether this can also happen within the airport and the airport become a really multiple of function to function as a holistic city by itself. So to just quickly show 2 of my students' work, one of my students actually in Yan'an, he imagined the airport could also be a waste processing center. Where the student work actually become very interesting is that the airport did not simply consume land and energy, but also actively recovered materials and generated value from waste. The value is not just from the retail shops and commercials anymore. In this proposal, the airport and the waste management were linked as one complete system, as a modular system that the same structure serves both the transportation and environmental infrastructure. And this was exactly the kind of thinking the studio was designed to produce. Not a conventional airport, not what you see every day and go whenever you travel, but a new civic ecology. Is a complete ecosystem rooted in modularity, resource recovery, and future growth. Another very quick example, which I found valuable in this student's project, was not only their formal imagination. You may think that both the form, they are very cool, but they are not the major value. I think the point is, these students actually use typology to question the social role of aviation infrastructure. This student, Truman, redefined the airport as the integrated transport and production hub. Recognizing, as you all know, Vietnam, especially Hanoi, is very famous and very big in economy for GDP for the production industry, shoe, fabric, anything, you name it. Hanoi identified as the production city. My student allowed the passenger to see the packaging. When you pass by the major hall after check-in, you can actually see how the workers are packaging and moving goods as they travel. The how of logistics that I work on in the Indian airport is not hidden anymore. It is instead being shown and revealed as the core identity of this city. The point was not to produce a single answer by this design studio. The point was to actually show that once the airport is treated as a type open to reinterpretation, it's not just for the airport. I think it is the same for any building typology that we get to work on as students or as architects, whether they are commercial office buildings, residential houses, or even a library. It can become every single project a site of speculation about how we want the future of the city to be. So the airport projects in India have given me the technical and operational reality. The design studio that I proposed actually allowed me to return to the airport typology with a critical distance. You may call it that gap, but that gap was actually to be close to ask what it means socially, culturally, and urbanistically. In this sense, the studio was not at all separate from professional practice. It was practice translated into pedagogy, and pedagogy translated back and supported solidly by research. If the studio has ever allowed me to test airport typology through teaching, my next phase of work pushed me towards the question forward at a strategic level. Not just how airports should be redefined today or in the future, but what aviation itself will become, say, in 50 years' time, by 2030, 2040, and 2050. At the Singapore University of Technology Design, I joined a research project that is called Horizons 2050 Research Project as a senior research associate in a collaboration with Foster and Partners. As you know, Foster's are very major in airport design, so it's a strategic partnership that we have worked. And the project examined the future of aviation through 5 domains: population, economy, politics, environment, and technology, as you can see. The population dimension, the demographics here, I think is very significant. That's why I would like to add a few lines in there. The rapid rise, again, with the Asia growth in aviation is actually because of the drastic demand of the new flying public, which is not at all a marginal trend. It is one of the central drivers of the global aviation supply and demand. That means that the future airport cannot be understood only through the current trend. It must be understood through the social transformation of who flies. We have way more budget airline now than ever. So actually, everybody, not just the nobles or the middle class, whoever in our world have almost at least flew once or twice. And what kind of urban life is actually being produced around this movement of the new travelers' demographics? The demographics of aviation are changing, and with them also the spatial expectations, spatial experiences of the airport should be changed itself. And of course, the economy dimension adds another layer. Aviation is tied to city mapping, land value, infrastructural investment, and regional competitiveness. The research made me question the default assumption that airport growth automatically equals urban benefits. But is that really so? Is that the bigger the airport, the more investment we put in the airport, it means that the city is more economically prosperous? Not really. Growth can be productive, but it can also intensify spatial inequality if it is not connected to civic structure. So then it goes into the question of civic integration. That's why I became increasingly interested in the relationship between airport system and urban topology. It's not just airport and city, but the systems of airport and the topology of urban as a system. Not just how aviation grows, but what kind of city it is producing and it will produce. Again, very quickly, that is one of my thesis students from last year. He proposed something called, I think, most radical critique of the economic soul of airports. Weber, his thesis is called post-capitalism architecture. While many of us, as I said, we see airport as a symbol of global progress, Weber and I actually identify airport as a site of common evils. We don't think it's actually that good to generate prosperity and economy. We think that it is possibly a victim of retail homogeneity and capitalist spatial planning because it's all retail. So it's actually super capitalist, very consumerism as well as a product. The why in this project is a fundamental question of civic priority. Why can't an existing infrastructure, which he chose Songshan after studying that Songshan actually has way more retail percentage compared to all the airports in Taiwan? We ask why can't an existing infrastructure also hold ecological, social, and civic value instead of just commercial and consumerism value? In his thesis, Songshan Airport in Taipei is reimagined as a post-capitalist urban food hub. Instead of treating the terminal as a space of retail consumption and transit, the project transformed it into an aeroponic farm, a food lab, and community kitchen. The airport becomes a place where crops, knowledge, and people all together circulate in a closed-loop system, rather than a machine for commercial and retail turnover. The how turns into navigating rigid infrastructural constraints through an innovative modular structural framework, as shown here. While it is also grounded in the specific urban condition of Taipei, where Songshan Airport actually is located at one of the highest valuable land inside the whole city, if not the country. We make this as a reuse and an adaptation rather than expansion, the more meaningful architectural question of how we can use this public space to create back from social value for the citizens themselves, for the cities themselves, and not just for the travelers. The research trajectory, as I've shown you from my practice into design studio, into thesis supervision, into my research project with Foster and Partner, this research trajectory has been formalized in my publications. Most recently, in the forthcoming paper this July, that my paper got accepted in the Design Computing and Connection Conference. It is called Restructuring a Pattern Language, Emergent Asian Cities and Airports Transformation, Analogy with American and European Cities. This paper, very briefly, we're not going to read the words here, and this is just one page. It should be 20 pages. Anyway, the paper develops a hybrid. I really like hybrid because it's a very fine balance of things. A hybrid method that combines the qualitative logic. If you have heard about a pattern language, the book by Christopher Alexander, with the quantitative mathematical rigor of space syntax. The paper proposes this new analytical framework for aviation-driven urban development, what I call aviation urbanism. It compares Hong Kong, Bangkok, London, and New York in order to identify the differences in structural conditions in urban typology under which social activities that airports actually generates, and how the relationship of neighborhoods adjacent to the airport can produce. The why is to decode the morphological and social implications of airport-driven development. But the why is a generative computational analysis of accessibility, connectivity, and intelligibility. Our findings reveal a very critical mechanism we call structural constructibility, which actually restore design agency to the planning process of aviation infrastructures, enabling the shift from maximizing logistical capacity, efficiency, to actually validate and hopefully verify what we call activity nodes, the social hub for civic integration. So if I step back from all the individual projects in the past 1 hour, What I hope the talk has shown is not just a sequence of unrelated words, but actually you see the logic of a linear line of inquiry. It begins with a question about the relationship between practice and research. And throughout this talk, I hope I have tried and successfully demonstrate to you that this relationship between practice and research, most often than not, as being seen as a gap. And this gap is actually a choice, not a necessity. And we can, I think, as designers, really break this gap or close this gap. Whether I am experimenting with paper plot for fiber space in Beijing, mapping the Taiwanese tin houses for vernacular in Venice Biennale, planning the logistical flow pedestrian flows in New Delhi, or resolving the super complex geometric roof in Hyderabad. I think my methodology in designing, making, and realizing spaces and architecture remains very constant. I don't see research as a phase that ends when the drawing starts. I see it as a mode, again, of inquiry embedded in the design process itself. Again, let me rephrase this. Research gives architecture its direction. Practice gives architecture its form. At every single stage, this same question returns to me. How do we make architecture intellectually rigorous without separating it from reality? For me, the answer is not to choose between research and practice. It's not to choose between theory and practice, or to choose between thinking and making. The answer is to treat architecture as a field where inquiry and construction remain in continuous, constant dialogue. You keep coming back and forth. That is why I have to come to believe so strongly in this practice research hybrid mode that I have been trying to put forward and explain to you today. I think I am a designer, a researcher, and also a practitioner. But above all, I am an investigator of the human condition in the built urban environment. Thank you. Oh, I'm very on time. I leave half an hour. We still have half an hour for Q&A or just casual talk.
那我们现在应该可以说中文了。
哦，对。
来，有没有什么立即的问题？我先问一些啦，就是刚刚也跟谢老师分享，就是我们在这边我们很强调有 research 的 design 啊，就我们也是一个建筑研究所，所以我们在设计课里面也经常的会有一些比较 research 这样的成分啊。不过虽然是这么说，在我们的这个 design studio 里面，还是以设计为主要的目标啊 ，research 可能是比较次要的一个部分而已。那我对这个事情的观察是说，当然以这个为例，最后是以 design 为目标 ，research 当那个阶段帮忙把一些这个不管怎么样的资料文献一些情况弄清楚，做好分析，更清楚设计可以怎么做，绝对会对设计有帮助的。可是如果我们把这个事情想得更深入一点，就是有时候会发现我们做 research 的头脑跟做设计的头脑会不太一样就是如果你要把这其中一个做到比较深、比较极致一点research 非常的严谨，然后这个理性的，甚至有点科学的头脑，跟在做设计要有一些创意美学那边的头脑，常常是不太一样的人。那如果是在practice 里面，如果我要做 research， 我要做 design， 也许是不同人在负责。你在做 research， 你在做 design， 我们可以一个 team 在一起做。可是，在学校里面，可能是一个学生，我又要 research， 我又要 design， 所以可能有点这个状况不太一样那我想是说，你有没有观察到这个现象？怎么去面对这个？就是有些时候可能会 在学校里面对学生来说，他本来就那个头脑就不太一样的哦，就是你是比较适合做 design 的人，你是比较适合做 research 的人，有没有这样的一个现象？
其实我觉得，我想 rephrase 这个 definition， 有一件事情叫 design research。Yeah. 对所以我觉得其实 design 也是其实是在不断的在 research， 然后不断的问很多不同的问题。可能做学生会这样，如果你是说做了很多年，已经很有经验，可能有一些问题，你在 design research 中间的有一些问题，你就已经可能觉得这样我是最快，或者我最熟悉这样做的，那个可能 research 部分就会比较小。但是我自己觉得学生很难会分开 research 跟 design 的。就是我觉得就算那个 head space 那个头脑可能 mindset 有小小不同，但是这两方面的东西对我来讲是一模一样的东西。因为其实我 personally 我不相信 design 只是有 artistic 的 sense， 因为我觉得 design 其实就是要用 research 要用 reason 来去 justify 它，才可以相辅相成的。
是啊，那其实我们这边也是很强调 design research 是没有错的啊。那只是说这两个其实如果你把它推到比较极端一点，它其实还是有各自不太一样的范围了啊。但是有时候我们可以找一个设定，让这两个可以结合的好一点啊。可能比如怎么样一个题目，怎么样一个 project， 它适合把这两个合在一起啊，就是蛮重要的啊。老师们、同学们，
我想问一个，其实是教学上面的可能是一个小细节，但我觉得很有趣啊。就是刚刚看到谢老师从自己的 practice 做 airport， 然后也变成这个继续的 research publication， 中间有 studio 的研究跟做法，我其实觉得蛮厉害的。一个是我自己没有想过这个用 airport 来当做一个 design studio 的一个 topic 这样子一个可能，然后就是一个是我们好像有没有这个机会去设计一个比较少机会去设计一个 airport 哦。那然后再看到老师您刚刚的一个 setup， 你是三个东南亚的城市，对不对？仰光、金边还有河内。那河内我们今年就有这个异地教学，所长就要带同学去哦，就会去河内 airport。对，可是仰光跟金边大概比较不是大家有机会会去到的哈。然后我刚刚看了一下，就是他们都有 street view， 就是你能够看到的这个得到的一些资讯，好像也不见得那么多。对，那在这个方向的研究，你在带同学做的时候，是怎么样让他们有一个远端可以 study 的一些方法？还是说他们真的大家都飞过去看？还是有没有什么这样的方法，在教学上面的过程是怎么样做到的？
首先因为这个 studio 是在新加坡的，是 base 在新加坡的，所以其实学生就很多都已经去过其中一个城市，而且可能因为新加坡我们那个时候的因为是 option studio， 所以是 undergrad 的最后一年跟 master 的第一年一个 vertical studio 来的学生也有 sponsorship。就是中间 reading break 的时候，他们就是一定会去一个 trip。另外就是你说的 data，其实东南亚已经比中国跟非洲的 data 来得多。所以也因为这个是一个 reimagining 的 project， 所以其实要用的 data 没有很实际的很多 scientific 的 mathematical 的 data。另外就是如果老师说这是可能机墙是一个很 niche 的 building typology， 很 niche，尤其是因为它的 scale 很大。但是其实我也做过另外一个 studio， 就是这个 studio 的2.0了。我们那个 studio 不是重新设置一个机场，只是在设计机场的一部分，因为那个时候就是在 COVID 当中，就是觉得机场其实很少人用，但是那么大，然后有那么多飞机停在那边，那中间的空间也不会停，就是电力啊，所有就是 Airport Express 还是在运行，那我们可不可以再创作，用那些空间，我就叫它就非空间的那个时候 non space。那其实也是因为 Foster 也叫它做 non space， 因为其实那些 space architect 本身设计机场的时候，那些 space 只是有 structure， 没有那些 facade 的，那些 facade 其实是很后来才加，这些 facade 其实可以很 flexible 的。所以其实如果你要做 studio 的话，做 scale 的话，其实也可以 zoom in 某一些部分来认识这一个 urban 的 transformation。
那所以后来有那个松山机场的研究，那个是在台湾带的。
对，那个是上一年的毕业设计学生。
我也有兴趣，您说松山机场是比例上面那个 retail 的比例非常大的一个机场，这个可不可以多说？这个学生是怎么样来判断这件事情？就是这跟我们一般的经验，因为它不是一个特别大的机场，然后 retail 其实就是一些像是便利商店啊，有一些这种面包店，然后咖啡那种服务而已啊，不会觉得它有特别像是国际机场有那个很大的一个 retail 的一个 shopping mall 这样子的一种感觉。那这个后面有趣的点在什么地方？
我只是把松山机场的那个 percentage 放进来了，但是学生其实在他的 thesis 的 establish 他的 research 的时候，他有3-4个这样的 bubble， 这是比较台中机场、小港机场，然后台中的 percentage 是很小的，好像8%，松山就比较多了0.26%。所以他才选松山机场，他就没有比较，好像 American Airport 可能就更多。
懂了，所以它是比较台湾的，比较是这种 regional 的，不是 international 的机场。OK。
他一开始的时候也有 study 国际的机场的怎样的 configuration， 怎样演变，他也有 study 过尤其是一个 phenomenon 做privately owned public space， 还有 publicly owned private space。因为其实机场 retail shop 最后就是变成某程度上是 privately owned public space， 所以就是虽然它是 public space， 但是其实就已经不是给 public value 用途的一件事情，所以他也有 study 过国际上面这个，但是当做实际数据上 retail 的 percentage 只是台湾。
理解，谢谢。
老师，刚刚设计课评图的时候，老师有参加上半场。那这样子，老师你的教学经验下来，你会觉得因为我们是学士后，然后学士后我们这一群不同背景的，有没有其他的可能性呢？
你们不同背景有没有其他的可能性？
对，
就是其实有更多的可能性了。就是因为你们已经拥有的背景，而且你们是比原本的学士 bachelor 再成熟多一点点，是看多这个世界，思考多一点点，所以就是要把你原本拥有的东西放在你的专注力上面了。你问的是这个吗？
突然被丢麦克风。
好了，有点像强迫同学的感觉。 正焕有什么提出来讨论吗？这个，比如说学生这个第一次 design 用这个题目，这是凑巧吗？还是因为
它原本的 starting point 只是 post-capitalism architecture，然后就是一直在 study 什么叫 capitalism， 为什么只有 retail， 所以它原本有4个目标，就是选其中一个就是可能retail shop 的 design 的 facade design， 然后其中一个只是机场，然后我们在讨论的时候是去到第1个学期尾才决定，我没有 convince 他才说那不如就做机场呢，就是这个有空间，也不只是一个 facade system 而且也有 city urban 的很多的 substances 在里面，尤其如果它是松山机场的话，对，所以是那么巧的，他交那个 thesis proposal 的时候没有选机场的。
像刚刚有一个部分，像学生提出了一个蛮有趣的一个 program 在机场里面竟然会像有这个 farm 这些东西存在 ，community center 的功能进到机场里面，所以这个是我们刚刚在讲 research design， 这个是比较是学生纯粹创意的想法，还是说这个部分其实在 program 产生也是有 research？
有啊。他的 research 其实最主要就是他为什么会选 urban farm， 就是他计算过所有的 crops 可以赚，他 propose 一些 crop 就是不同的月份，这是台湾的 crops， 他预计可以赚多少钱，然后也有他就是机场租金收入 revenue 方面可以赚多少钱，最后都是retail 比较多的，可以 reach 得到比较多的收入，但是 urban farm 不会 deficit， 也没有差很多，所以我就觉得这个是一个很 convincing 的 proposal。如果你是说创意的话，有不同背景的学生，我试过有新加坡的学生他也是选仰安的。那个时候2019年刚刚仰安安上 Suki 给人做了，然后他那个时候的创意就是，那我不如把机场中间的变做一个 legislative parliament， 这是很超级 political。然后他就说，我就是要把这一间整个社会要 hidden 的最密的东西，我就是要放到最透明的地方，所有人都会看见。然后他的 proposal 就是怎样安排这个 circulation 中间的那个 atrium， 最主要就是 acoustic 了，怎样所有议员要辩论的时候 traveler 可以见得到，但是不会吵得到他。就是很多，然后这个24小时 24/7 一直在 run 的一个机场，又怎样可以 combine with political 的 institution， 这些都是可以有不同的背景来，我觉得是可以想得到的创意了。
好。还有没有同学们？差不多。好了这个如果没有更多的提出讨论，我们就今天演讲停在这边咯。好。
是老师有去过很多不同的国家，然后在那边有做设计，然后带领设计，然后我想就因为到了一个新的国家、新的地点，然后你们会怎么用就是对陌生的环境，然后找出线索，然后做到
找出什么
线索？
对，
然后做到设计的方法，就像为什么台湾你们会选择铁皮屋，而不是其他的东西？
我不觉得这一个是关于学生的背景的。 我觉得这个教育的 methodology 跟 design 的 methodology 都是一样的，但是可能不同的就是你 set 的 program， 跟你可以拿取或者吸收的文化这个脉络可以不同。就是如果我不是参加台湾的 Pavilion 去 Venice Biennale 的话，我就不会用贴皮屋。我可能在香港的话，我就会用龙屋。那个很小很小的农屋，然后如果我是参加新加坡的 Pavilion 的话，我可能就会做 shop houses， 这是地铺像住宅，这是但是这个跟学生是没有关系的，这个是文化的背景怎样限制这一个 project 的 development 的关系，我觉得。
我在帮他补的，同学的问题是说。像您这边很快就会说你哪个区域你可能会怎么做啊？刚才同学问你说，如果是一个很陌生的地方，你并不了解它，但是你有需要为它做设计，那你怎么去找到刚刚说线索啊？就是一些 clue ideas， 是说那我应该如何做？用什么方法去做调查吗？怎么找到你的方向啊？
怎样做调查？调查就是要去看一看，住一个吃一个东西，跟他谈一些话，这个都已经是调查的一部分。还有什么可以调查？数据咯，人口的分布，年龄，density，这些数据上面都是不同的地方会给你不同的答案。
所以还是各方面的啊，要花时间的。
我可以解答得到你的问题吗？我好像很 generic 的说，但是我不知道我有没有解得到你的。
同学们想要看看有没有什么快速方法的感觉？最后好像得到的答案是没有捷径这样。我们这个暑假开头，我们是6月下旬，我们会去河内 Hanoi，所以我们现在也在做一个课，就是去之前的准备。我们对越南，特别是 Hanoi 是完全不知道的，怎么去之前透过这样远距的方式，有办法了解它，了解够深入。我们也在做这个学习啊，
很重要 GDP 的变。
GDP
越南这5
增长很
年
快
来是 Southeast Asia 最快的人口，它的 density 怎样？有多少人从农村？如果你 study urbanism 的话，那个 percentage 有农村搬到去城市，那个 percentage 超级高的。对，天气也是一个很大的陈述了。
好，可能那我们就停在这边了。好，感谢谢老师。
谢谢。